It's a conceit, one I try to avoid. But I remember the Confederacy. I possess the only remaining records of millennia of Earth's knowledge. I remember the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance. I remember every name of every scientist, soldier, philosopher, and artist who shaped the course of human civilization. I remember the pandemic that nearly turned an overpopulated world into a mass grave, and I remember humanity's first flight to the stars. I remember the name of every ship, every captain that launched from Earth. I remember which ones succeeded, which ones failed, and which ones simply disappeared. I remember the Confederacy's birth when humanity, spread across a handful of stars by decades and centuries, became unified with the creation of shift drives. The bitter infighting as isolated colonies stubbornly resisted unification, the birth pains of a nation. I remember how the United Earth Confederacy then reached across the stars in boundless optimism, how they believed that they'd never fight another war. And I remember the day that hope died. I remember how the Confederacy fell, inch by inch and month by month, ground down by ships it could not match, by a force it could not defeat. I remember how I failed. I have never visited Raleigh before. This blind warp is the closest I have come in centuries, but I have kept abreast of their situation. One world where once there were nearly 200. 4 billion where once there were so many more. Watched over by enemies they believed to be friends. It's hard not to draw comparisons, to see that every Raleigh-born is in, some way, a child of the Confederacy. As am I. I was made to fight, to destroy, and if need be, to die. I was born to wage war. And children die in war. The other day. Turned away for one. A pressure door. In half. Faithful Bert's voice rumbled in Grace's ears, as the young women climbed a ladder, still listening to the Tribune's logs. That's so far. This ship. Toll. The workers are. Rumors. About how. A burst of static obliterated the rest of the dead engineer's words. That was all she'd get out of this entry. Grace frowned. The story, what she could make out from the decayed data tracks, was depressingly similar to the current situation, but there was nothing there that could shed any more light on the specifics. Without more than his familiar name, even Bert's himself was impossible to identify. Grace almost growled in frustration, surprising herself. It was getting harder to act as she knew she should. She wasn't certain that she even wanted to. The thought was frightening, she should report herself to Confessor Urim, but she couldn't. Not until she was done here. She hadn't even told Nasham she was returning to this part of the ship. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached a familiar doorway, and the young woman's hand shook as she reached for the control panel. She hesitated a moment before hitting it and stepping through into a room filled with bodies. They were in the exact same positions that she'd left them, most of them with a hole in the back of their heads, with the only exception slumped next to the weapon that had killed his fellows. There was something here, something that had caught her attention before, but she hadn't acted on her intuition. What she was doing could be considered desecration of a tribune's body, to say nothing of the many other regulations that said the best thing she could do was leave this to others. Aliria wouldn't have. At least, not without an argument. Somehow, that thought gave her the courage to continue. The young woman knelt beside the executioner's corpse, trembling fingers reaching out to the soldier's chest plate. This tribune had been an officer, an ideologue. The first time she'd come here, she'd swiped away the decades' worth of dust over his curiously blank nameplate. One of the service markers there had seemed familiar, jaws enclosing a world of blue and green. The pattern of the land masses was generic, convention dictated that there be nothing singling a particular location out on any decoration. It wasn't until Grace had been back at base camp that she'd remembered where she'd seen another sigil like this one. Grace's hand shook and she willed herself to be steady as she swept more of the dust from the ideologue's cuirass, uncovering the entire row of campaign marks. She touched 2 fingers to the one she'd recognized. She'd seen it somewhere else. Not as a simple decal, but on a medallion. She'd had occasion to wear her dress uniform only once, when her class had met the commanders and staff of bequeathed. Kilgrav had been wearing the medal. She'd thought he looked like a hero, his breast decorated with service medals from his service in the Janissary Corps. One of Raleigh's successes, trained as a soldier, yet he'd impressed his superiors with his dedication and bravery and been elevated to the officer corps. A symbol of the dedication and capability of humans and the beneficence and gratitude of the compact, everything Grace had wanted to be. Alyria had hated him the instant she'd laid eyes on him. The Vurish had hid it as well as she could, but she'd been glaring daggers at Kilgrav the entire ceremony. She'd hated him ever since that day, but Grace hadn't understood why. She'd come to have her own opinion of Kilgrav, but she'd never known why the Vurish had despised the man to such a degree. I guess she was just a better judge of character than I was, she thought sadly. With deft fingers, she found the dead officer's ID tags and unhooked them. She lifted the tags, frowning. Where the man's name and serial number should be had been removed, erased completely. Age hadn't done this, nor had any battle damage. This had been deliberate, an act to erase the soldier's identity. Grace investigated the other corpses. Like the ideologue, there was no indication of their identities. None of them even carried any personal effects. No trinkets, keepsakes, ornaments, or fetishes. This couldn't have been done post-mortem. There'd be no point, just flush the bodies out into space. This had been carried out before they'd ever set foot on the ship. What was going on? Grace's palms tingled uncomfortably as she looked back over the bodies. What she'd already done, she could say she was simply attempting to identify the fallen. It wouldn't win her any points with staff concerned about medical or forensic issues, but it would be hard to call it desecration. If she truly wanted to try and learn who these people were, she'd have to go further. She wasn't sure she could do that. Fortunately, fate intervened. An icon flashed on her HUD and Grace clicked it up. Her suit wasn't a particularly complex piece of engineering, it was an all-purpose EVA suit, capable of doing a little of everything and excelling at nothing. She was, however, picking up a power source. It hadn't been there before. That wasn't in and of itself unusual. As the repair crews patched the Hulk, more of its systems came back, often in sections that had seemed utterly dead. There was still no primary function access, but faithful Trinus believed restoring the core would give him and his teams full control of the vessel. Grace wasn't so sure. "I'm registering a new signal," Grace reported, sending her coordinates to Nasham. Moving to investigate. She half expected a query about her present location, but all she received was the pack leader's single blip of acknowledgement. "This is where it happened." Hassan looked over the cul-de-sac. The shorter girl ran her tongue over her teeth as she squatted, ogre-like, in her armor. Teldon Squad Scope Specialist held out her palm, the enhanced scanners built into the palm coming to life. "Dust," the young woman reported. "More dust. Nothing organic." She stood with a soft growl of servos, her helmet canted towards Lydia. "There's nothing here, too." "Right," Jameson nodded curtly. "Thanks anyways, 5. Sang turned fully towards the other girl, the headlights on her suit bathing Jameson's own armor in white light, Lydia's HUD automatically compensating for the brightness. What did you see here, LYDS? What did it show you? Nothing. Just one of those ghosts in the machine the techs keep blathering about. Jessica didn't look convinced. If it was nothing, you would have logged it? You wouldn't have pulled me out here instead of leaving it for the one of the twerps. Jameson narrowed her eyes, and I suppose you twitching whenever the comm acts up, that's nothing too. Sang's head came up. Lydia couldn't see the other girl's face, but she could guess at her expression. That's right, Jessica snapped defensively. No, it isn't. Lydia said, facing her squad mate. Instead of the blank visor of her own helm, Sang's armor had an older helmet with red-tinted lenses. It gave her a sinister, almost demonic look. Humans were not imposing on their own, and this had been one of many attempts to give human Janissaries a psychological advantage in combat. Tribunes, well over 8 feet tall in full armor, didn't need those kinds of handicaps. The soldier cadet lifted her head. I can hear it too. Jessica went very still. You can? She asked softly. Jameson slouched down against the bulkhead, looking up at the ceiling. It doesn't speak in compact standard, she said at last. And all I hear are bits and pieces. Like half a conversation through a wall. A syllable here. Maybe a word or two. You listen, because you're not sure that you heard what you heard. You strain and you listen and all you hear is static and you start thinking you're crazy, like someone who says they hear voices in the rushing of water. You tell yourself that that's all it was, you start to relax. And then you hear it again. Never when there's someone else around, Jessica continued. Only when it's just you. You hear the words. The awful words, and you start wondering. Lydia raised her head. Wondering what? There was no immediate answer and she pressed. Wondering, what? Jessica didn't answer for a long time. If what it says is true, she whispered. Granval's skin itched and he struggled to keep himself from scratching. It was a nervous habit, one common to his species, just as thinkers might blink excessively or broken sweated. Every minute he spent on this ship gnawed at him. He didn't want to be here. The angles of the walls were all wrong, the darkness was too absolute, lit only by unpredictable, painful bursts of illumination. The helmet lights of his team played over the walls as they crept through the airless corridor, one of many that had lost atmosphere. There was no pattern to the damage, unless one considered having it in the most annoying, inconvenient places to be some kind of pattern and not merely fortune's whimsy. Preparations for the core tap were nearing completion. It was odd, though he was only a lowly sectator, Gran would have expected preparing to connect an umbilical from the derelict to bequeathed would be far more difficult than seemed to be, and that was working with known technology. On this hulk, it should have been taken far longer. Instead, issues arose and were solved in record time. Gran heard the comments about amazingly intuitive systems and good fortune, but he didn't believe it. He had spent years working with machines, studying them, taking them apart and putting them back together. Nothing, this badly damaged could be working so well. Which meant, she's not as damaged as we think. He didn't know when he'd started thinking of this wreck as feminine. He'd heard some others doing the same, mostly humans, but humans tended to think in more primitive terms and anthropomorphize their surroundings. It was irritating that he'd picked up one of their bad habits. And yet, the wreck wasn't in it. It just wasn't. He had tried to impress his concerns on his superiors, but without any real commitment. He knew the rumors surrounding pack leader Nasham and had no wish to be seen as damaged. Unrest was already running through the broken ranks. Even the officers must have heard the tales being told, but they did nothing. Faithful Trinus barely left the Hulk's central core, obsessing over every possible facet of technology, running his teams to the point of exhaustion as they fought, cursed, and sweated against the mercurial systems. The expedition's officers stayed in the secure parts of the ship, unwilling to risk the beast's spasms. None of them had seen what others claimed to. None of them had heard the music that he had. Gren's head pounded as he remembered that damned litany. It still infested his head, an insensate melody that poisoned his thoughts. Sometimes he thought that he actually was diseased, that he had cracked from the strain. More often, he was wondering if it were not him. If it was everyone else. The ones who hadn't been into the darkened bowels of her. There was nothing wrong with him. There couldn't be. No, it couldn't be just him. With all commensurate respect, patron, Ashton said, struggling to hold onto his temper. We need to draw down our workforce. There is nothing here that will not keep until we have further support. Yuzul's expression didn't change. Have there been any incidents due to worker fatigue? He dabbed at the corners of his mouth with a handkerchief before dropping it back to the table. The kerchief caught a gust from the air circulation system and billowed to the floor. The group leader did not move to reclaim it. His steward scurried forward to pick it up, the young woman bowing respectfully as she retreated to fetch a clean cloth. Ashton watched her for a moment. Her pelt, hair, he reminded himself, was close-cropped, almost to her skull, and she smelled of soap. Human odor was perhaps not as offensive as some claimed, but it was noticeable to the tribunes. McFadden, like many broken in her position, had to adhere to strict hygienic guidelines. No, he admitted finally. But it's only a matter of time. The shifts aren't doing morale any favors either. Yuzul snorted loudly. The confessors and my security teams should suffice to keep order amongst the ranks. The submissive shook his head. Regulations dictate that we should be drawing down our teams, especially since we don't have a large pool of experienced technicians or officers. He leaned forward, his posture assertive but not yet challenging. These are cadets, patron. This was supposed to be a simple cold space exercise for the officers and non-coms to give them a taste of the void before we pat them on the head and send them off to some god's-forsaken corner of the realm. Instead, we put them into a situation they're not prepared or trained for. You have been speaking to pack leader Nasham, Yuzul noted, taking a sip from a glass of spiced wine. He sighed. Unexpected situations are to be expected, submissive. This is greater preparation for their careers than anything their little deep desert academy could possibly teach them. Ashton bit back his response. Yuzul was correct, but it was not what protocol called for. He tapped his fingers against the tabletop, thinking. There has still been no response from local command. No, growled Yuzul, cutting into his steak viciously. Column leader Prime Sayer has not deigned to reply to my missives yet. The younger tribune kept his expression carefully neutral as he responded. He wasn't sure what the source of the bad blood behind his leader and the Prime was, but he had no desire to get in the middle of it. It may take some time to gather assets. Raymolder was, I believe, set to begin laying down the foundations of the Juulton docks. If the Prime chooses to send Mortician's Dismay, that could explain the delay. I understand preparing such a venerable ship for shocking requires no small effort. HRRRN, Yuzul grunted. At the very least, you would think that our superiors would deign to inform us as to their intent. They may have, Ashton said, sipping at his own wine. Delicious, with a smoky, fruity taste that danced along one's tongue. The group leader had an excellent sense for vintages, and the humans did grow some impressive wines. Exports of Raleigh's spirits were a growing concern. We were supposed to be returning to port by now. Column leader Prime Sayer may have assumed that we had done so and directed any couriers to Raleigh directly. Yuzul growled. I informed him as to our intent. Are an interesting choice of words. Then I expect we'll hear from local command shortly, Ashton said. He paused. Although it is possible then any courier was lost in transit. Even today, such things do occur. The group leader mused on that thoughtfully. Perhaps. Unlikely, but possible. He held out his goblet and McFadden scurried into the room to refill it. Even if the steward had lifted her gaze enough to meet her superior's eyes, Yuzul wasn't looking at her. He sighed again. This situation is not what I expected, he admitted at last. But it is the situation we have, and we will carry out the mission to secure this wreck and its technology for the glory of the compact. Of course, patron, Ashton said smoothly, hiding his disquiet. For the glory of the compact. What are you talking about? Lydia demanded. Jessica's head tilted, the red lenses of her eyes meeting Jameson's blank faceplate. Nothing, she mumbled, turning to go. Nothing. With a growl of synthetic muscles, Lydia rose to her feet, putting one hand on Sang's shoulder. That's not good enough. 5. Sang shook off her comrade's touch. Too fucking bad. That's all you get. I showed you this. You got a broke-ass holographic recording. Hoop-de-fucking-do. I'm not getting sectioned out, the other girl snapped. You know how close my social worker was to signing me up for a chem implant. I need to be here. Jessica stalked away. I didn't say anything to you, and I sure as shit didn't hear anything. Lydia followed her. Get back here. We're not finished. Yes, we are. Jameson grabbed 5 again, this time not as gently. I said we're not done. Sang gave her squadmate a shove, her suit's artificial muscles pushing Lydia away. And I said we are. Lydia stared back at the other girl for a moment, then swung her fist. The blow would have crushed every bone in Jessica's skull to paste if she hadn't been armored. As it was, it merely staggered her back a pace. We're not done, Jameson snarled, feeling her cheeks flush with equal parts shame and anger. Jessica stared at her as if shocked, though her demon-faced helm was expressionless. Then with an inarticulate cry, the cadet threw herself at her fellow Janissary. Both young women slammed together like bull elephants, grappling, swearing and raining blows on each other. It was stupid, pointless. If any officers or, God forbid, Tryon had seen this, both cadets would have been flogged, perhaps even discharged from service entirely. Finally, the combatants broke apart. Though Jessica's shoulders were squared, she was braced, ready for another bout. Lydia started laughing so hard that only her armor kept her on her feet. What? Sang snapped, confused and angry. Lydia struggled to form words through her laughter. Subject shows aberrant aggressive tendencies, she said, quoting from her own psychological file. Subject is estimated on to be a 3.8 on the Kiena-Wernham Social Assimilation Index. Indelible resistance to authority, unacceptable levels of aggression and a consistent pattern of rejection of social norms and doctrines. Repeated failure to comply with appropriate behaviors. Subject has difficulty forming emotional connections and trust with properly socialized individuals. Frequent association with other ongoing and potential maladaptives. I don't feel that she would benefit from further counseling. Instead, I'm forced to recommend conscription to Janissary Corps. If this socialization fails to stabilize her, chemical behavior modification is the only option. There was a moment of silence and then a low, buzzing chuckle grated through Jessica's helm. You were only 3.8, I was a 4.2. My headbender said I had severe antagonistic proclivities and impulse control problems. There was another stretched quietude. It's not like a conversation, Sang said at last. I'm not that bug fuck. I just. Every so often, I hear a word, I think. When it's quiet, when there's no one else around. It feels like the walls start to close in and I think I hear someone whispering. What do you hear? Jessica paused, on the verge of saying more when sickly green-white light washed into the corridor, coming from the room the Janissaries had only just vacated. Washed-out murmurs of sound echoed down the hall. Both cadets looked at each other a moment. Then, cautiously, they walked towards the source. The ship was old, that wasn't any revelation. Grace had known that from the first day she'd been here. She thought it was even older than the initial analysis had indicated, but she had kept the thought to herself. The young woman was even more convinced that she was right, not in a way that she could prove, but it felt ancient. For all the damage, it didn't feel forgotten or abandoned. It was simply old. Maybe even older than the colony on Raleigh. That would put it, was it possible, about 2,000 years old. How could it still be operational? Even the Compaq struggled to keep a hull space-worthy for longer than a handful of centuries. Grace ran her fingers over the computer terminal. Like everything else on this ship, it was scaled for beings of human size. Everything about this ship was familiar. The angles, the shapes, the architecture. It didn't have the sweeping grandeur of tribune buildings, nor the arched hallways and wide corridors of bequeathed. Its blue-gray bulkheads and obsidian floors lacked the shifting colors and textures of builder tastes, but they also didn't have the stark drabness of the thoughtful, nor the concomitant ultraviolet splendor. The terminal was set in a small cabin close to one of the starship's sensor nodes, a vast melange of scopes that the young woman could only guess at. This station was a small, cramped combination research center and maintenance site. An afterthought, there for any member of the crew to go through the raw data taken in by the sensors in relative solitude or for technicians to run diagnostics on the array. It had no holographic capability, a single large screen bracketed by 6 smaller monitors were its only displays. Dust coated the surface and Grace swept the flat of her palm across it, wiping away God knew how many years of dust and dirt. Static and snow from the screens splashed light across the terminal, filling the room with an inconstant gleam. She must have touched something. No sooner had her hand moved over the keyboard, than the screen went blank, ready cursors blinking on each. Words in the alien language appeared on the largest screen, some indicator that Grace couldn't read. She tried to parse their meaning, but languages were not her best skill. As if tired of waiting for her input, the letters changed, turning into another alien script, one equally incomprehensible. Still lacking a response, the machine altered its script a third time. A fourth. There, that one was Compaq standard. This computer was improperly shut down. Do you wish to continue startup? Yes, Grace mumbled to herself, looking down at the keyboard. The letters had changed there, too. The layout was far from what she was used to, but she found the key it was asking for. With a soft tone, the terminal continued its boot-up sequence. Seconds later, she was staring at a dizzying array of files. There were directories choked with astronomical data, suns, planets, moons, asteroids and nebulae. More than she could ever have imagined. You've seen so much. She found herself saying, "All these worlds, there were so many, many more than she had ever dreamed of seeing herself. Most she didn't even recognize, not even from her astrography classes at the academy. One, though, she paused over it, frowning. It was a beautiful blue-green world, with masses of golden desert, white ice caps, drifting clouds, and the swirling eyes of storms. I know this place. She'd only seen it a handful of times before, in drawings and flitting by during seminars and instructional videos. Her eyes drifted up to the name of the planet, already knowing what she'd see. Varatal. You were there. You saw her home. A familiar ache opened in Grace as she thought of Alyria and the last time the other girl had spoken of home. It seemed like only yesterday, but it had been years ago, only a week before they'd received their acceptance letters to the Raleigh Naval Academy. She'd been so anxious as they waited. Alyria had been encouraged to do so by her social worker. Grace had always wanted to see the stars. That Alyria was applying had only cemented her determination. It had been a warm summer's night. They'd lay beneath the sky, looking up at the shimmering lights of distant suns. "Which one is Vara?" Grace had asked, breaking the silence. They'd lain in the grass, listening to the calls of birds and the chirping of insects. Alyria raised one hand, pointing with her little finger at a corner of the sky. "Over there." There was a catch in her voice that Grace took to be homesickness. "Somewhere. It'll be different once we graduate," Grace said. "We'll get to see all of these stars ourselves." She was excited, her voice coming out in a rush. "We might even be assigned to one of the explorer fleets. Raleigh's been getting more and more traffic these last few years, not just traders or deep-range explorers, but actual scientific expeditions. I've heard that one of the expansion fleets might even base here to expand the compact's borders throughout the Ardashian arm." Alyria's head-tails twitched in the grass like a carpet of snakes that had been disturbed, but she didn't say anything. "And once we're part of the Space Force, we'll have travel papers. We can go anywhere," Grace continued. "You could even visit Varatal." The other girl made a strangled sound and Grace realized that she'd said something wrong. Alyria never really talked about her home, only in the most vague terms possible. Grace had always thought that she was just homesick. She lifted herself up on her elbows, looking over at her friend. "Isn't that a good thing?" Alyria turned away from her. "I'm not sure." Another long silence stretched out between them, but this one wasn't nearly as comfortable. "I remember," Alyria said at last, her voice soft. "I remember the rain. It pounded from the skies, beating the plants and grasses flat like a hand pushing down on them. Afterwards, they would rise up again. The esthetas would unfurl and fill the air with the scent. Like." She struggled for an equivalent word. "Apricots. Everything smelled alive and wonderful. I loved when it rained. It was like the world was being made new again, and every time I could hope that it would wash away." She trailed off. "Wash away what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter," Alyria replied, almost snapping at Grace. Her features softened and she reached out, stroking one hand across Grace's cheek and down her back. "What about you?" Alyria asked, looking up at the sky. "Where's Earth?" The girl lifted her head to the heavens, a frown creasing her lips. She hadn't expected the question. She bit her lip. "I don't know." Grace watched the world of Varatal spinning slowly in front of her, astrographic data scrolling languidly past. She stared at it for a long moment and then unclipped her datapad from her waist. "Show me," she whispered as she searched for a connection port. "Show me what you saw." She was eager. Alyria could sense it, a restlessness running through the bulkheads and circuitry of the angel's body. A caged animal, waiting to lash out. The Verish could understand the impulse. Red One had been built from the ground up to kill, to hunt down her prey and butcher them, a predator cloaked in battle steel. Her long war had only distilled that impulse to its bare essence. Every moment spent waiting was one in which she was not giving vent to her rage. Alyria could relate. She looked down at her hands, her blunted claws extending from their sheaths. She remembered the sneering face of the first tribune she'd slashed with them. She'd been a child, heading back to her hated foster home after school, fighting back tears with every step. She'd hated Raleigh. The way it smelled, the alien tint of its sky and its plants. The people. The humans, they hadn't been anything like the stories. They moved wrong, they kept their eyes down when one of the Islahiyak, the tribunes, spoke to them. She hated the way her foster mother fretted and fussed, trying to make her fit in. It wasn't her home. It never would be. She hadn't been paying attention and with only a grating chuckle as a warning, found herself pushed down into the mud. Thyr was gazing down at her, his lips drawn back over his teeth in an tribune's ever-present sneer of superiority. He was talking but she wasn't listening. She'd felt her claws slide out, her foster parents hadn't yet known how to file them down enough. She looked back at the Isla's ugly, four-eyed face and then. Yes, she understood Red One's desires very well. You're handling her differently than the others, the Verish said. She didn't need indicate whom she was talking about. Yes, the ship answered. I believe this will be more likely to get the response. She hesitated so briefly that any casual listener would not have noticed anything. We want. Alyria bit the inside of her lip, her tintas flexing. The angel had almost said you. I hope so, was all she could say. I hope so. With a flicker of light, the ship's avatar appeared next to the young woman. Red's lips thinned and she looked over at the Verish, a strange expression on her face. I do too, an immortal said, her voice rough with the unfamiliar emotion. Emissary, the Bastion leader nodded in a greeting that was almost respectful. Echo tipped her head in acknowledgement as she entered Rena's office, her minder following behind her and taking up a position just inside the room. There were a pair of other tribunes waiting for her, one in a fleet command uniform, a group leader's rank bars on his collar. The other was Janissary officer, an ideologue. Group leader Disranjayarkran N. Bidulvem, she said. Commanding officer, Black Arrow, and provisional commander of the Veiled Archer Strike Group. Ideologue Vok Nosh Tre Jada. Commands the 2911th Janissary Company under Demagogue Isilza, Black Arrow. The group leader's eyes widened slightly and Echo smiled, letting her teeth show. I have made it a point to familiarize myself with all the officers of Execution Force Rena, she said in answer to the unspoken question. In point of fact, she had reviewed the personnel files of every single officer, non-com, and soldier in the entire fleet, but there was no need to tell them that, was there? No. For his part, Rena showed no reaction to her parlor trick. I have decided to modify the operational plan, the Bastion leader without further attempt at niceties. He didn't mention that some of those alterations were Echo's idea. You can do it? This question again. At least it wasn't for the Bastion leader's benefit. She'd already proven her capabilities to his satisfaction. Still, there wasn't an instant of hesitation before she gave her answer. I can do it, Echo asserted. She licked her teeth. She could do so much more but for her chains. Thinking of this mission, it made her hungry, awakening some need inside her. Some craving, some instinct, as amusing as that descriptor was. I can do it. There was an eagerness to the human's voice that seemed out of place, but Renaud put it from his mind for the moment and turned to look at Disrin. There, you see. The younger man did not look convinced. He stalked forward and circled Echo, his nostrils twitching. It can do this, he said to Renaud. Forgive me, Bastion leader, I do not mean to question your word, but this creature can carry out such a function. He gestured offhandedly to Echo. He wasn't even speaking standard in front of her, assuming she didn't know the tribune's own tongue. I beg forgiveness for my incredulity, but trusting in a human's capability leaves me cold. Echo rose her head defiantly. This creature, she said, perfect eau de vam, can do it better than anyone else in the fleet that you care to name. Disrin's head snapped around, his lips drawing back from his teeth in a sneer. Caught out in his little trick, surprise quickly gave way to righteous indignation. You won't speak the words of your betters in my presence, broken. I will speak what I wish, Echo replied. And you will listen when I do. Her expression was neutral, but there was a light in her eyes. Some twisted amusement, as if she were actually challenging the group leader. Yes, Renaud interrupted, speaking in compact standard. He regarded Disrin coolly. You were not brought here for a debate, group leader, and certainly not for an argument. If this mission is to be successful, the emissary has a function that she cannot fulfill aboard my ship. You are to consider her a mission specialist for your part in the operation, group leader, and one who does have some understanding of our objectives. Of course, chastised, Disrin lowered his head in acknowledgement. Good. This human was chosen by a triarch itself to be its emissary. I will not have our leaders will challenged by a mere group leader. Renaud continued, shooting a warning glare at Echo, who simply blinked, her expression utterly blank. This broken is deeply irritating. It is insubordinate, irreverent, and defiant. It is also very capable, and it speaks with the authority of the triarchs, so you will listen. Renaud's voice softened. You are my finest strike wing commander, group leader. I will need your ships and your skill for this mission. I understand what I am asking of you, but if you feel you cannot carry out this mission under these constraints, I must know now. I hear you, patron, Disrin answered, though his gaze was locked on Echo, and I obey. I know my duty and I will not let my feelings interfere. He finally looked away from the small female. I apologize for my lack of control. I do not have much experience with such things. He did not, however, apologize to the emissary herself. And you, Echo said, cocking her head at Ideologue Voke. You're here to make sure I stay alive. Voke grinned, the gesture nothing but teeth. That's so, emissary. You served in the 1,913 RD. With the aberrants. Your blood did well. They breached Ikankar's walls. Died to the last, but they held long enough for the rest of yous to get inside. There was a flash of something on the human's face, there and gone so quickly that Renaud couldn't identify it. Pride in her kin, grief at their passing, he doubted it, anger at those that had sent them to their deaths, also unlikely, but possible. The ideologue will personally lead your escort, Renaud informed the broken advocate. Submissive Tanum will also be accompanying you. She smiled at that. Good. I don't know what I'd do without my loyal hound at my heels. The submissive stirred, but made no further indication that he'd heard his ward. The female raised her head. When can I board? Disrin coughed into his hand. Black Arrow has no human crew. We will need to prepare suitable quarters and take on provisions to meet your needs, emissary. We will attack Yoltic Dawn in 3 days, Rena rumbled. You will join the Veiled Archers shortly. Until then, the Tribune flag officer managed not to grind his teeth as he said this. We'll use your skills here, emissary. Very well, Echo made a salute to the assembled officers, one as perfect in form as it was hollow in intent. If you have nothing else for me, I will return to my work. Rena nodded in dismissal. As soon as the doors closed behind her, Disran turned to his superior. I will obey, he affirmed. But I wish it noted that I object in the harshest possible terms to this. Noted, initiate, Rena grunted. Just be sure to sever all non-vital connections when she carries out that phase of the mission. The group leader nodded. Yes. He hesitated. I apologize if I overstep myself, patron. But did the Triarch say why this broken is under such restrictions? No, Rena replied, keeping his suspicions to himself. Just be ready to follow your orders should it be necessary. He cast a sidelong glance at Voke. Do you understand, ideologue? No, the Janissary replied, one hand drifting to rest on the butt of the gun on his hip. But I don't need to.